Catlin Clark, Juju Watkins, Angel Reese, Audie Crooks. Chances are, even if you're not a big sports fan, you've heard these names a lot in the past few years. Women's basketball is receiving more media attention and fan engagement than ever before, largely thanks to the dominance of Iowa's own Catlin Clark. Clark is a phenomenon and arguably one of the best basketball players of all time. But what you may not know is that excitement around women's basketball is not an anomaly in Iowa. Join me in this episode of Nooks and Crannies of History to explore more about the origins of women's basketball and why it makes a lot of sense that the person who has done so much to generate excitement around women's basketball worldwide is from Iowa. My name is Jessica Peel-Austin, a public historian, coming to you from Brucemore, a National Trust site in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. If you love history, or even just like it a little bit, please subscribe to our channel and ring the bell for notifications every time we upload new content. I grew up in a small town in central Iowa. When I was attending high school, I remember sitting in the gymnasium on many occasions, looking at the pennants hanging from the rafters listing state championship qualifications over the years, and not thinking that there was anything unusual about seeing a pennant from when our girls' basketball team won the state championship in 1930. I thought that every school around the country had similar flags. I didn't know that most American girls couldn't compete in high school athletics until the 1970s. I remember packed gymnasiums for girls' games. I remember the excitement there was for the girls' state tournament each year, even when our team didn't qualify. I didn't realize at the time that what Iowa girls had was special. Iowa has the longest consistent history of any state in the U.S. of supporting women's basketball. If you are from Iowa, there is a good chance that your mothers, aunts, grandmothers, and great-grandmothers played basketball during their time in school. Since 1920, well before the equal opportunity mandates of Title IX, Iowa has offered its girls the chance to play competitive basketball through a variation on the game known as 6-on-6. Access to interscholastic competitive play for girls helped generations of women build athleticism and confidence and gave their communities identity and pride. Basketball was introduced to the world in 1891 when James Naismith, a physical education graduate student at Springfield College in Massachusetts, was tasked with creating a sport that could be played indoors during the cold New England winters. The school's janitor found 2 empty peach baskets that they then nailed to the balcony railing in the school gymnasium. Players were given instructions to score on the opposite team's basket to earn points. The first boys who tried it liked the game and kept asking Naismith to play, so he wrote up a list of 13 rules. Those 13 rules were published for the first time in January of 1892 in the Triangle, the newspaper of Springfield College. The sport was introduced to women for the first time that year when Senda Berenson taught women at Smith College how to play. Unsurprisingly, there were immediate concerns about girls and women playing basketball. Mostly people were afraid of women overexerting themselves or exhibiting unladylike behavior. But many female PE instructors liked the game and thought it could be safely played by girls if there were modifications to the rules. This was the birth of 6-on-6 girls basketball, and official girls' rules were adopted by the Conference on Physical Training in 1899. Iowa was right on the basketball trend. The earliest known girls' basketball game in Iowa took place in Dubuque at a YMCA in 1893, remarkably soon after the sport's creation in a world without the internet, television, or radio. Mentions of games are found in newspapers all over the state by 1900, and over the last 125 years, there have been so many great players long before Catlin Clark who played women's 6-on-6. Some of the most notable include Union Witten's Denise Long, who was the first woman drafted by an NBA team. Ventura player Lynn Lorenzen holds the national record for the most points scored in a women's high school career. But I want to zoom in and focus on a small town that exemplifies the trajectory of girls' basketball history in Iowa and closely mirrors the trends, along with some surprising divergences. So we're going to learn about the history of 6-on-6 basketball through the lens of my hometown, Perry. Perry is a town of around 7,500 people just northwest of the state capital of Des Moines. Girls' basketball play there seems to have started in the very earliest years of the 20th century. The first photos I have been able to find show a girls' team from 1910. What would have these early girls' games look like? One major difference was the number of players on the floor, which could vary between 6 and 8 depending on the size of the gym. The major difference between the men's and women's games was that men played full court basketball, meaning players could travel up and down the court, playing both offense and defense. This was thought to be too strenuous for women, so the court was divided to give the heart moments of rest and concentrated energy. Until 1934, the girls played a three-court game. Centers would play only at the center court, performing the center jump to determine possession after every field goal. The two forwards were the only players who could score points. The two guards would stay at the opponent's court and could only play defense and could not cross the center line. The division of the court with the limits on which players could cross the center line meant that the girls' game required more strategy and teamwork versus the physicality required in the full-court men's game. These early games for both men and women could be very slow and low-scoring. The center jump after every field goal slowed things considerably. Girls were limited in their number of dribbles and had to be strategic about their movements. Fouling was frowned upon. To slow things even further, the earliest nets were closed at the bottom, so the ball had to be freed after every made basket. It was no surprise then that the average game only scored between 8 and 14 points. The uniforms that girls wore are my favorite part. For basketball, girls and women wore bloomers and loose-fitting blouses. They still wore stockings to cover their legs, but could wear lightweight tennis shoes to make play comfortable. Girls wore their usually long hair back to keep it away from their faces and to keep guards from pulling it. Many teams had matching hair ribbons, and some even wore matching hats. Importantly for Perry and for many other schools at this time, girls' play was intramural rather than interscholastic. The Perry's boys' teams could play against other neighboring schools, but the girls were relegated to playing with each other. This is reflective of a larger debate occurring across the country at the time, especially in the institutions that were producing female physical education teachers. Many of the advocates of limiting girls' participation in competitive sports were, ironically, female physical education instructors. Three main beliefs were guiding these women to reject competitive sports. One was a belief that anything more than moderate physical activity was bad for women's health. Two was a belief that intramural competition was better for all women rather than a select few that could play at the varsity level. And three was the belief that girls were being exploited by allowing the public to watch the girls playing sports, and even more so by raising funds this way through ticket sales. All of these beliefs are going to play an important role in directing the course of girls' basketball history in Iowa. The Perry girls appeared to have played their first interscholastic game in 1920 against Dallas Center, a town 18 miles away. The following year, they were allowed to start playing other teams regularly. This mirrored the statewide trend of increasing interscholastic play for girls. The Iowa High School Athletic Union offered the first statewide tournament that same year in 1920. The first state championship team was from Correctionville, but they almost didn't make it to Des Moines to play because their school refused to cover their costs. The girls and their coach raised the funds themselves and showed the school administrators the error of their ways. Perry played its first full season of interscholastic basketball in 1921. The girls were coached in part by 3 different female teachers and assisted by Mr. Barnes, the boys' basketball and football coach. The team played 6 games against neighboring towns and ended with a 4-2 record. The first big season for Perry girls came in 1925 when they had an undefeated season and hosted the state tournament. 4 teams played in a round-robin style tournament: Perry, Applington, Muscatine, and Ida Grove. It ended in a tie between Ida Grove and Applington. But this tournament was almost the last one for Iowa girls. The Athletic Union voted to drop its support for girls' interscholastic play, despite the popularity among schools. The concerns about the appropriateness of girls' play and the concerns of female physical educators, mostly in the larger districts, were part of the reason. But the main reason was resources. Especially in larger schools with more competition for gym space and supplies, boys' sports were simply the priority. At this point, most of the larger school districts, like those in the state's largest cities, Des Moines and Cedar Rapids, dropped their interscholastic programs if they had them. This was true nationwide as well. Of the few other states that had supported girls' competitive play in the early 20th century, most had withdrawn support by the mid-1920s. When the Iowa High School Athletic Union dropped its support, a group of 25 men, mostly from smaller Iowa towns, rebelled. John W. Aggins of Mystic shouted at the meeting, "Gentlemen, if you attempt to do away with girls' basketball in Iowa, you'll be standing in the center of the track when the train runs over." These 25 men formed a new union, the Iowa Girls High School Athletic Union, the only one of its kind still in the nation just for girls athletics. The IGHSAU, as I will refer to it in the rest of the video, was at the time and for much of its history an exclusively male-run organization, but they recognized that basketball had become a huge part of their students' lives and a part of their town's identities. The response to the new union was positive, and in 1926, 159 schools fielded teams. Perry appears to have jumped right into the new union and fielded a competitive team for 1926. For the next several years, the Perry Bluebirds were one of the powerhouse girls' teams alongside Audubon, Hampton, and Ida Grove. They appeared in the 1927, 1929, and 1930 state championships, winning the title in 1930. For the fans who couldn't make it to the game, a play-by-play relay was done over the telephone. Their star player, Helen Hauserman, was team captain and running center. She was lacking in size, but made up for this deficiency in speed, brain work, and fighting spirit. She was chosen as the All-State running center 2 years in a row and was later inducted into the IGHSAU Hall of Fame alongside other players from the 1930 team. In 1934, a big change was in store for girls basketball in Iowa. After the 1934 tournament, the 3-court game was changed to a 2-court game, and the center positions were eliminated. Teams would now be composed of 3 guards and 3 forwards. Forwards were the only players who could score, and they were limited to 2 dribbles before having to pass or shoot. These changes sped up the game and increased scoring. These changes defined the 6-on-6 game for the rest of its history and is the style of play that most people remember. Most schools embraced these changes, but Perry did something surprising. Perry's female head coach, Miss Schroeder, on the heels of a successful 1934 season, held a tournament to determine if the new rules were too strenuous for her girls. She must have thought so, because for the next 17 years, Perry did not field a competitive team. Perry girls went back to playing only intramural basketball, while all the tiny towns around them like Dawson, Jamaica, and Rippey continued to play each other. A generation of girls lost their opportunity to compete despite the success of Perry's program before 1934 and the rapid growth girls basketball would see after the rule change. This shift away from competition showed that the old debate about basketball's appropriateness for women was still alive, especially for teams coached by a female coach like Perry's was before 1934. Girls basketball became an Iowa cultural phenomenon in this era. Virtually every small town had a girls' team, and gyms would be packed every week to watch them play. In 1947, 70% of all Iowa high school girls played basketball. The state tournament was designed to be a spectacle. Girls who made it to state were treated as royalty. Entire towns would basically close down when their girls' team went to the state tournament. Veterans Memorial Coliseum in Des Moines, where the tournament was held, would be filled and tickets often sold out in advance. People who couldn't make it to Des Moines to see the games live could listen to the games on the radio starting in 1948. When Wellsburg won the state championship in 1949, a caravan of cars following their bus back home stretched for 6 miles. Starting in 1951, it was broadcast on television. It was no wonder as the game continued to gain popularity, girls from schools with no competitive basketball started to agitate for access to the sport. They wanted the opportunity to be hometown heroes too. While girls basketball had stopped in 1935 due to the rule change, it made its return to Perry High School in 1951. They were now known as the Jayettes and wore stylish new uniforms with skirts and crop tops. Like most teams of the era, they were now coached by a male coach, Harvard Barr, and had a female chaperone who would assist the team. The first season back did not go well. They lost all but 1 game, which was not surprising considering the 17-year skill deficit the girls had to overcome. Things started to turn around in 1954 with a new coach and several veteran players. The following years brought continued improvement for the girls, but no state tournament appearances. One thing that hasn't been widely researched is the experience of girls of color in 6-on-6 play. Because of the early divide between the larger schools and the small rural schools playing the competitive game, and because most of Iowa's smaller Black population tended to live in the more urban areas of the state, that meant that few African American girls got the opportunity to play on the state's competitive teams. One of the first African American players on a girls' team in Iowa that I was able to identify was Dolores Brown, who played for Ankeny and led her team to the state championship in 1953. She was the first African American woman inducted into the IGHSAU Hall of Fame. Perry was also one of the few schools that had known African American players in this era. Between 1961 and 1968, Perry had 3 African American girls who played on some of the most successful teams in school history. Perry girls made it to the state tournament every year between 1962 and 1966. Players Jan Davis and Gwen Beasley were some of their star players. The experiences of girls of color is an area of research that is lacking in the history of Iowa girls 6-on-6 basketball. So if you know of any women of color who played 6-on-6 basketball in Iowa, particularly before 1972, please leave a comment down below so we can help connect you with resources to help capture that story and make sure it isn't lost. By the early 1970s, Iowa was seen as a leader in the country in girls' athletics. 20% of all girls playing high school sports nationwide lived in Iowa. But in some ways, Iowa was holding its girls back. While 6-on-6 remained massively popular among players and spectators, it presented a dichotomy. Iowa's 6-on-6 game kept girls' sports alive throughout the 20th century when most states abandoned the sport. But at its core, the rules were based in the sexist notion that girls could not compete in full-court basketball in the ways that boys could. Many of the larger Iowa school districts had started offering intramural basketball in the late 1960s or early 1970s, intending to have players ready for competition in the early 1970s, as more and more girls were asking to play and national attitudes about girls' sports were changing. Some of the larger districts chose to play 6-on-6, but many wanted 5-on-5 play. Title IX of the Education Amendments was enacted in 1972, and this changed the conversation around athletic participation for girls. It prohibits sex-based discrimination in any school or any other education program that receives funding from the federal government. For girls' sports, this meant that public schools had to start offering equal opportunities for girls to participate in competitive sports. And importantly, by the time that Title IX passed, the colleges and professional leagues that were offering play for women were playing full-court 5-on-5 basketball. Girls who played 6-on-6 were then limited from accessing scholarships to play basketball at the college level. It was particularly discriminatory to women who played guard positions since they were unable to do any scoring, so they never learned any offensive ball handling or shooting skills. I asked Lori Seeley, a player for Perry from 1972 to 1976, if she or her teammates thought about the debate that was happening surrounding 5 versus 6 player basketball. And she said most of the conversation was between parents and coaches, and that she recalled that most of her teammates just enjoyed playing and competing. That wasn't the case for all players, though. In 1983, 3 girls filed a suit against the state alleging that 6-on-6 basketball was discriminatory. The IGHSAU was faced with a difficult choice. It recognized that the 6-on-6 game would likely be found to be discriminatory, but it was popular and profitable statewide, so they made a compromise. Starting in 1985, they would offer schools the option to compete in either 5-on-5 or 6-on-6 player games in the state tournament to allow all girls to continue to compete. They knew, though, that the days for 6-on-6 were likely numbered. Perry stuck with 6-on-6 and made its first return to the state tournament in 22 years in 1988. That year, Perry was the only team to have both its boys and girls teams in the tournament. The girls returned to the 6-on-6 tournament one last time in 1993, the last year that it would be offered. Administrators decided to discontinue it despite its lingering strong popularity. They wanted the sport to end on a high note, rather than letting it fade as fewer teams opted to continue playing. Most players and fans reacted with sadness, but also realized that the 5-on-5 game that their daughters, nieces, or granddaughters would play would be better for players to reach their full potential. From the first known girls' basketball game in Dubuque in 1893 to the last 6-on-6 game played in 1993, Iowans have been some of the biggest supporters of girls' basketball in the country. I told the history of 6-on-6 through the example of Perry not because they were exceptional, but because the town's story is like that of so many other small Iowa towns. It's a story of girls who got to play and excel together in times when girls across the country didn't get that opportunity. So whether you find yourself watching March Madness this year, or maybe just a Pee-wee game at your local rec center, remember that for most citizens in the U.S., girls' equal access to competitive sports is a change that has happened in our lifetimes. The joy and excitement that players like Catlin Clark have brought to the game is possible because generations of Iowans supported generations of female players before her. We hope you've enjoyed this look at 6-on-6 basketball in Iowa, and we hope you'll join us again for the next episode of Nooks and Crannies of History.